Fallout 4's Nuka World is arguably the most unavoidably evil DLC that Bethesda has ever produced, with the sole survivor finding themselves overboss of 3 different raider gangs based around the ruins of Nuka-Cola's theme park. And, just like the main story and Far Harbor, there's several conclusions to our Nuka raiding adventures. So, let's take a detailed look at each of Nuka World's endings in order to determine which, overall, is best. Down at the bottom then, I uncharacteristically find myself putting the quote-unquote good ending to Nuka World as objectively the worst one. You see, most of these endings come down to a question of which raider factions stay alive and which gets utterly obliterated. Those that remain will then provide us, the overboss, with unique perks, gear, tributes, radiant quests, and more. But make no mistake, each of Nuka World's factions, that's the Pack, the Disciples, and the Operators, are, as we'll learn, unquestionably evil, with the straight-up murder of innocent settlers being among the lighter atrocities that they've committed. And as fun as going more irredeemably evil than ever before is in this game, Bethesda, of course, created a solution, messy and tough though it is, for all the unflinchingly good-oriented characters out there, in the form of the quest Open Season. To begin this one, you'll want to head to the Nuka World market, where traders are literally forced to work the stalls as slaves to do business with wandering caravans, each of them branded with a shock collar to prevent any kind of escape. Like I say, the raiders are cruel in ways far more devious and cunning than the mindless rabble of the Commonwealth. And if the content here wasn't so heavily oriented to throw in with the raiders, playing the hero in this case would be far more of a no-brainer. Speaking to Dr. Mackenzie, she sees her new boss as a big opportunity to potentially secure freedom for herself and all the other traders. After all, it's not like we applied for the position of overboss or went through any rigorous tests to ensure our lack of morals. Rather, we simply reloaded enough saves until successfully surviving their obstacle death trap known as the Gauntlet and killed the old boss, whom everybody seemed to hate anyway and were desperate to replace. There's no real reason, besides our strength, for us to fit the role of tyrannical raider boss. Though, even after immediately telling Mackenzie to speak with more enthusiasm to me, she's still brave enough to shoot her shot, suggesting we kill all the raiders. Pitching it, of course, to be in our interests. The raiders, after all, had their old boss killed, and taking them out is the only way for us to truly sleep soundly at night. And if we could free the enslaved residents at the same time, that'd be nice too. We'd still rule over Nuka World, technically, but more in fitting with our benign role as General of the Minutemen. So, simply asking Mackenzie about killing all of them, she'll explain it's more a case of cutting the heads off of the snakes, taking down the leaders, which will magically put an end, more or less, to the region's gang problem, scattering them off into groups that are now too weak to reclaim Nuka World once we liberate it. This will cause the open season quest to begin, which, if not completed, will annoyingly linger in your quest tab. So if you're fussy about that sort of thing, then simply threaten her with violence from the off, and she'll pipe back down to a regular, albeit enslaved doctor. You can still trigger open season later, simply by killing one of the bosses or wiping out one of your outposts. Just bear in mind that the sheer number of angry raiders you'll have to fight through doing it this way makes it arguably one of the toughest fights in the entire game, with the bosses themselves especially having insane health pools and rapid healing capabilities, what with being surrounded by Nuka-Cola. All the other endings simply involve fighting one gang backed up by the other two, but for this one, it's us versus everyone. The shackled traders definitely aren't coming to our aid, and if Porter Gage is your companion at the time, then he'll turn on you as well. These guys can handle multiple Nuka Nukes from the Cappy in a Haystack reward, and are just a real pain to kill, especially 3 times over. So I'd recommend at least getting a sneak kill on the first one, if you can. But aside from the ridiculous challenge of fighting off one of the game's largest settlements entirely on your own, something usually tried briefly just for fun after quick saving, that's more or less all there is to it, which is kind of the overall issue with this ending, actually. The overflowing treasure troves of ongoing rewards teeming from the raider factions are non-existent here, and returning to Mackenzie, we simply get a pat on the back and a thank you for taking down an entire park of powerful organized raiders completely on your own. Now it's time to get these collars off. I mean, technically, we are still the overboss, but unless you're heartlessly tormenting innocents in this case, that doesn't actually mean much. That all said, this is totally worth doing just so we can give this response at the end.
You killed the raiders. All of them. have to ask, why?
Not sure, really. Yeah, I guess I just felt like killing a lot of people.
Oh, okay, boss. I, really hope you've scratched that itch now. I've thought about this day, now that it...
The utter dryness with which that's delivered is just gold. But after that, most of Nuka World content does simply dry up. There's nobody else around to dish out Radiant Raider quests, and even Red-Eye, the radio announcer, will leave, silencing Nuka World radio for the rest of the game. Though we do at least get a miscellaneous objective to turn on Nuka World's power still, fighting just ghouls this time through the power plant for a slightly less eventful pushing of the button, though one that all the same turns on all the parts of the park that need power, allowing us to unlock Scav Issue 5 in Dry Rock Gulch, the final star core for the Quantum Power Armor, and the schematics for Project Cobalt in the Nuka-Cola bottling plant. Additionally, all 5 quests pertaining to Nuka World's 5 regions will still be available if not yet completed, and in fact, taking out the raiders and restoring the power immediately after arriving in Nuka World, then completing each of these 5 quests, allows us to do so with the power already on. It's not a route I'd recommend, but an interesting one all the same. One of the only Raider-esque NPCs left standing after all this then is Fritsch, the guy in charge of the Nukacade, who technically isn't a Raider anyway. He's usually the one we go to for the amoral combat quest, which is repeatable and involves us fighting other brave warriors who'd made it through the gauntlets, much like we did at the start of the expansion. Now, usually this triggers every couple of days after completing the 5 quests associated with Nuka World's Grand Tour, but in this case, while still a possible occurrence, amoral combat will be far more rare and unpredictable. Another big drawback to this ending, because upon defeating the Rogue Brotherhood Knight, the 6th opponent to this repeatable quest, he'll drop a unique Gatling laser, Eternus, which is Latin for endless or eternal, and has been modified to use a fusion core rather than fusion cells, effectively meaning it never runs out of ammo. There are more powerful guns out there, but having this as a permanent sidearm can put to bed the issue of running out of ammo entirely. And like most things in Nuka World, this ending is not the way to obtain it. You'll probably have finished the entire game by the time the Rogue Knight comes along if you do it this way. The only other big benefit to doing open season then, albeit one only relevant if killing the raiders before completing Home Sweet Home and taking over the Commonwealth, is that Preston Garvey won't hate our guts forevermore. Whilst constantly being told that another settlement needs our help can get annoying, Preston does have his own uses and perks, things that we'll come back to. But for now, in this ending only, he is still our friend. What's more, an entire settlement of tyrannical raiders lies dead at our hands, their captors are free, happy, and we are a hero. Yet, this definitively is not how Nuka World was meant to be played, so let's see just what being a good character means we're missing out on. Whilst Open Season offered a wildly different and potentially shortened ending to Nuka World, the next 3 are a lot more similar in tone. Basically, one of the 3 factions will turn on us, and we'll take them down alongside the other 2. The way to determine this then is fairly simple. Prior to the Power Play quest, which is the real ending to Nuka World, we'll have 8 settlements to divvy up, the 5 Nuka World regions and 3 we capture in the Commonwealth. 8 isn't divisible by 3, and therefore somebody will always wind up short. Whoever it is will turn on us, and if 2 factions have equally less, then it comes down to chance. Effectively, each of these endings are about choosing who you don't want, which of the factions are least cool to have around, or offer the worst bonuses for helping them out. For each of these entries, we'll be looking at the bonuses we miss for pissing off this particular faction, but also why they do deserve to be taken off the board on a more moral basis. But first, let me take 30 seconds to direct your attention to the most relevant sponsor for this Nuka World themed video. No, it's not Nuka-Cola because they sadly don't exist, but gamer subs do exist, and are perfect for boosting my perception, intelligence, and let's be honest, probably charisma during long gaming and production sessions. Each of the larger packs contains 100 servings. It's easily one of the best tasting ways to supplement a caffeine addiction, and if you're wanting that quantum color, then I recommend simply their blue flavor, which you can check out down below. Back to Nuka-Cola though, and the worst faction to get rid of if you ask me, is the Operators. Definitely the least violent of the three choices, the Operators are less fussed about savagery and more fussed about making caps, similar to the pre-war gangs of old. Of course, in a world where currency is dictated by a count of bottle caps, there's a little less scope for what said wealth can buy you. Money may be the driving force of the Operators, and it's not quite as terrible a force as their counterparts, but they do still of course need food, security, and all those annoying basic life necessities as well. Plus, when it comes to running jobs, when we really break it down, they go in for all the same barbaric practices as their counterparts, and their leaders specifically have done some pretty questionable things of their own, which we'll look at. Running the show are siblings Mags and William Black, alongside their co-conspirator and evil scientist of sorts, Lizzie Wyeth. And rather unsurprisingly, Mags and William originally belonged to the snooty upper class or upper stands family back in Diamond City, and it sounds as though Lizzie was also their classmate in school. From listening to the two holotapes on Mags's desk, it appears as though their mother used to beat them into being the perfect children of a wealthy family, and the pair of course rebelled quite drastically, to the point where they were arrested for terrorizing other school kids. At this point, embarrassed, their mother saw fit to refuse them their inheritance. This of course enraged the entire trio, and according to Mags's take, they came back to claim their inheritance by force. That ultimate lust for wealth never ceased, but their time in Diamond City apparently needed to, and they wound up at Nuka World having gathered a group of like-minded, caps-oriented individuals. And for Lizzie specifically, this unfettered access to innocent settlers enabled her to further advance her less than moral scientific practices. Following their pattern of less openly violent crime, Lizzie aims to manufacture a drug capable of making anyone affected highly susceptible to suggestion, granting Kilgrave-like abilities to make people, or victims, do as they're told. And this entire experiment is recounted through her terminal logs. Starting out with jetheads, Lizzie eventually had success with some farming settler women, forcing her to do things like taking off her clothes, getting violently attacked by disciples, before finally straight up torturing the woman, getting her to a state where she desperately wants to flee to test if the drug will prevent her from doing so. And after sending her out for some supplies, she does come crawling back, though dies shortly after from the wounds previously inflicted, highlighting just how terrible a state the Operators must have put her in. And evil though this experiment was for the subjects, the end result is something Lizzie will give us during the Home Sweet Home quest. The persuasion grenade, when thrown at the feet of settlers, will make them more likely to agree to leaving peacefully during quests to take over their settlements. In fact, the story of Lizzie's entries is a cool canon explanation why these grenades only work on these NPCs. Something about harsh farming in the wasteland being tiring on the mind. But at the end of the day, whilst this invention isn't used with good intentions, it is the only attempt by any of the gangs to preserve life in any way. A means to conquer the Commonwealth without bloodshed, and giving the poor shuffled off settlers the chance to rebuild somewhere else. Did Lizzie care about this when designing the formula? Probably not. More likely it served as an amusing abuse of power. Still, if it can be used to do evil in a slightly more good way, then I guess that's commendable. But whilst this may be the least violent, though still formidable faction, the more immediate reason not to aggro them comes in the form of the bonuses obtained. The grenades, as mentioned, can be grabbed earlier, so we can get all the variants of those from each gang anyway, but the Ace Operator perk is only obtained after one of the factions turn on us. This grants us an additional 10% negative visibility whilst in the shadows, and fittingly 25% more damage with silenced weapons. So silently mowing down hordes with a maxed out deliverer is now going to be even more effective. But speaking to Mags at the end of Power Play, she'd also have granted us, in the other two endings, the Relentless Advanced Operator's Sniper Rifle. It looks like an AK converted into a sniper, and yeah, that's exactly what it is. Barely making a sound with its silencer, but being incredibly, and I mean incredibly lethal. Granted, we can effectively build the same weapon ourselves if we do betray the Operators, but this way is far more straightforward. Plus, this one comes with a unique ability to refill our entire action points on a critical hit, making for a very, very powerful crit hit loop in VATS. I love this thing, and given it's the only ranged weapon of the 3 faction weapon rewards, unless you're playing a melee-only build, it's always a no-brainer to get this one. And fighting off the operators means facing down both Mags and William in the final fight, as opposed to just Nisha or Mason. Granted, nowhere near as hard as taking down 3 entire factions in one go like the previous ending, but just something to bear in mind. So overall, based on being the least mindlessly violent, as well as the awesome perks for keeping them around, I'd say the operators are the worst choice for which faction to take off the board in Nuka World. But given how nice the rewards from the pack and the disciples are as well, it's not necessarily that straightforward. Next up, we have the pack, or rather, the option to not give the pack enough settlements and wind up aggroing them instead. Unlike the operators, these guys run under a much more basic and primitive hierarchy, similar to a wolf pack in the sense that the strongest is in charge, but can be challenged for dominance by anybody brave enough at any time. Currently, the guy at the top is Mason, who aside from not knowing what a resume is, who does after 200 years, isn't quite as barbaric as you'd expect. Yes, he wears the full face paint and howls in battle, but speaking to the guy, it's kind of clear he's just playing a role, being the part of pack leader, as it's a system of governance that simply works for them. Hell, these guys aren't even the most beast-like people in the park. That title would go to Sito, the gorilla-raised, Tarzan-like man up in Safari Adventure, who, by the way, unsurprisingly, gets on best having the pack move into his territory, who fortunately seem to get on well with a man who literally is what they're simply pretending to be. But whilst they're following a certain way of life, the pack are still responsible for a number of barbaric atrocities, one of which lands us with a disturbingly awesome piece of decor. The feral ghoul chair is literally a living feral ghoul molded into the supports for a chair. I guess it would feel like sitting on an uncomfortable lap. As for random traders and settlers they find that are still human, they're food, more often than not, for the pack's animals. At least I hope just the animals. And by heading into their underground area, we can find several settlers placed in rags and locked up in cages alongside a Brahmin. And on a table outside the cage is the remains of another settler, albeit carved up beyond recognition as though it were a slaughterhouse. So, if the operators are all about exploiting the weak for their money, then the pack are all about exploiting them for their calories. And this is even taken a step further by the pack's special grenade, known as the Predator Grenade, which, when thrown, will attract nearby animals to run rampant to the location, again asserting the natural order of the food chain. They may boast bright colours and vibrant weapon paint jobs, but getting into the grit of how violently this gang operates, it's easier to understand why Preston straight up refuses to speak to us or be our companion after sticking with the raiders, leading to a moment of confrontation where he tells us we have become the very thing we swore to destroy, and we say that we have brought peace, justice, and security to our new empire.
Your new empire?
Or we just tell him to shut up. After all, maybe this entire expansion was actually structured to put an end to hearing that another settlement needs our help.
I got word of a settlement that needs our help. Here's the location.
Uh-huh.
I trusted you once. Never again.
Yeah, no, he still says that. In fact, that's now the only thing that he does say. And quick side note, a good thing to do before turning Preston against you forever is to first max out your relationship with him, as this will grant the United We Stand perk to increase our damage and damage resistance when outnumbered 3-1. Overall though, in terms of raw gameplay bonuses, it's tough to argue just for keeping Garvey on side as opposed to the Nuka World Raider factions. And the perk, Pack Alpha, is a very good reason to avoid this version of this ending. It straight up decreases our damage taken by a huge 25% across the board and increases our melee damage by again 25%. Useful for everyone, but especially if you go in for melee attacks. Something again complemented by the weapon Mason will give us in the alternative endings where we keep him alive. And again, the puncturing rocket baseball bat is something perfectly viable to upgrade at a crafting station ourselves, but its legendary effect of making consecutive hits on targets more damaging means pummeling our opponents has never been easier. A perfect time to chuck on a leather jacket and assume our role as the Negan of the Commonwealth. So, whilst the pack's barbaric nature, respect only for strength, as well as, the fact they feed their prisoners to their animals are pretty good reasons to piss these guys off and take them out, their bonuses, especially the reduced damage from the Pack Alpha perk alone, it's largely why why they're not sitting at the top of this list as the best gang overall to take out, and thus the best ending to Nuka World. Because that would be to take out the Disciples. By far the most openly evil of the three Raider factions, the Disciples don't kill through a primal, animalistic survival of the fittest need to, but rather because they want to, for pure thrill and enjoyment. And before we came along, as the gang sat idly, growing increasingly impatient at the inaction of Coulter, the Disciples got to work spicing up the means through which we would eventually overthrow the Overboss. The Gauntlet, that utterly deadly obstacle course, and our introduction to Nuka World was largely the product of this faction's sadistic minds. In a world where rules no longer apply, the Disciples have given in to their more serial killer-like tendencies and come together as a group to find ever more creative ways to kill. Each of them wear these Mouth of Sauron type masks in a bid, I suppose, to be these terrifying, murdering, and yet faceless entities of death. With their leader, Nisha, acknowledging that a gang whose primary objective is to kill will struggle to get on peacefully all the time with two neighboring Raider factions, despite the near limitless supply of innocent settlers stumbling in here for them to have fun with. And thus, she's created a golden rule for her Disciples, that any crimes, however twisted or gruesome, are indeed permitted, but only under the condition that they don't get caught. Otherwise, she will deal with them personally. Now, I know that we're the big unkillable Overboss, but in terms of game canon, I'd feel especially uncomfortable having these guys serve under me, with no natural order or sum of bottle caps to keep them in line. I mean, even if you maintained a fresh supply of victims for these guys, who knows? No doubt one of them at least has some fantasy about murdering the most powerful member of the Raiders. And cool as their whole sadistic, almost Dark Brotherhood-esque vibe is around here, their watch the world burn attitude doesn't exactly make a good founding for a strong establishment of Raiders. But I suppose if the operators are the businessmen, the pack are the warriors, then that'd make the Disciples the artists of the factions, only ones that used live people as their canvases. Which brings me on to the Disciples' rewards. Perks and items will have to forego choosing this ending. Their perk, Chosen Disciple, makes kills with melee weapons restore 25% of our action points. Still useful, yes, but definitely more situational than the other two, and only relevant when getting up close and personal. These guys feel like they'd always operate from the shadows with the whole not getting caught thing, and it's almost as though the Ace Operator perk fits more in line with this style. However, their weapon reward, the Instigating Disciples Cutlass, fits far more in line with this, dealing double damage for targets at full health to open up massively the potential targets we can take down in stealth. Realistically, for a massively stealth-based character, purely for this reason alone, I'd say keep the Disciples and do away with the pack instead. This blade is totally worth it, and the Disciples will probably respect your style enough to not kill you. Probably. But if you just like the look of this almost surgical instrument, then you can of course obtain that from various dead Disciples, or just crafting the Cutlass Blade mod at a workbench. Again, the whole style these guys are going with is terrifyingly cool, and their standout craziest member we can meet by far is Dixie, who appears to adore killing even more than the rest of them. So much so that she gives us with the final unique explosive known as the Fury Grenade, which, when thrown into a crowd, sends all perpetrators into a frenzy, mindlessly killing literally everybody around them. No doubt utter music to Dixie and the rest of the Disciples' ears. And no doubt if the Nuka World gang setup didn't make for such a good means of perpetually committing murders, these guys would burn the whole place to the ground in a heartbeat. And therefore, I think on balance, it's probably best to take them out before that happens further down the canonical line. And if you're a massive fan of their decor or something, you can after all still build that stuff at settlements. It's not like that gets locked out afterwards or anything. But as always, let me know in the comments what you think is the best ending to the Nuka World DLC and why. Do you have a particular favorite of the three Raider factions, or does your love of helping out yet another settlement mean you wipe them all out immediately? And don't forget to check out Gamer Subs down below so you too can enjoy some sweet drinks whilst exploring Nuka World. Huge thank you to the patrons for supporting my content. I'm Sam Bram, and I'll see you in the next one.